The cold wind howled through the empty streets as dusk fell over the small town, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. Inside a cramped, dimly lit auction house, an unmarked wooden crate sat on the floor. The room buzzed with low conversations and the occasional clink of coins. At the front of the room, under the flickering light of a single bulb, stood an elderly dog. His once sleek fur was now matted, his eyes clouded with age. His name was Rex, a retired canine officer who had spent the better part of his life chasing down criminals, his loyalty and courage unparalleled. But now, after years of service, he was to be sold off. His fate hung in the balance, and no one in the room seemed to care. A murmur spread as the auctioneer lifted his gavel, calling out in a matter-of-fact tone, $1. The room fell silent for a moment, as if the weight of Rex's past service demanded respect. And then, as if it were nothing more than a transaction, the bidding began. But when the auctioneer's gavel finally slammed down, the price was still an insult. Rex was sold for $1. The realization hit like a punch in the gut. The dog, who had once risked his life every day, with nothing but his loyalty, was now nothing more than a piece of property. Show your love, hit like, share, and subscribe for more. The room was colder than it had any right to be, the walls echoing with the muffled sounds of people conversing in low voices. The harsh fluorescent light flickered, casting an unsettling glow over everything. In the center of the room, a single wooden crate sat empty, except for the heavy presence of Rex, the retired canine officer, who stood quietly beneath the flickering light. His fur, once sleek and strong, had become patchy in places, graying around the edges, his once vibrant eyes now clouded by age. He had spent his best years chasing criminals, saving lives, and earning the respect of every officer and civilian he encountered. Yet now, here he stood, a shadow of his former self, waiting for the inevitable. Dan, Rex's partner and handler, stood at the back of the room, his eyes locked on the dog. His heart was heavy with an emotion he couldn't put into words. Rex had been more than a partner. He had been his best friend, his protector, his constant through the hardest days. They had shared the kind of bond that went beyond words. Rex had been there when no one else had saved him time and time again. But now, there was no place for him in the world of law enforcement. Rex had reached the end of his service, and his body, once strong and swift, was failing him. Dan swallowed hard, trying to push down the knot in his throat. He hadn't expected this, hadn't thought it would come to this. He'd always believed that Rex would live out his retirement in peace at his side. But as time passed, the bills piled up, the surgeries, the vet visits, the medicine. It became clear that Rex's retirement was no longer financially viable. And so, the decision had been made for him. The department had told him there were no funds for Rex's care. Dan was left with no choice. Rex would be auctioned off. A single tear slipped down Dan's cheek as he watched Rex stand there, his head slightly tilted, as if he, too, could feel the weight of the decision. The dog had always known when something was wrong, had always sensed his emotions. Dan's chest tightened with guilt. He had been a good partner to Rex. But this felt like betrayal. Rex had served honorably, had given everything for the department, for the community. And yet, here he was, being treated like a commodity, his worth reduced to a $sign. The auctioneer's voice broke through the haze of Dan's thoughts. "We're starting the bidding at $1. He called out, his tone detached, as though it were no more than a simple transaction. Dan couldn't believe it. He had expected Rex to go for more, perhaps a few $100, a price that would reflect the dog's worth, his service. But $1. The words stung. A murmur rippled through the crowd. No one seemed to care. This wasn't a dog who had once saved lives, who had risked everything for justice. This was just a tired old animal, his body worn down by years of service. The people in the room saw only his age, his graying fur, his slowing steps. They didn't see the hero that Rex was. They didn't see the bond he had with Dan, the strength that still lingered in his eyes. Dan stepped forward, his heart racing. He wanted to say something, to explain who Rex really was, to tell the room about the dog who had saved his life more times than he could count. But the words wouldn't come. All he could do was watch as the bidding began, his hands trembling at his sides. He had to let go. The price for letting Rex go, the price of this sacrifice, felt heavier than he had ever imagined. As the gavel fell, Dan felt his world shatter. Rex had been sold for $1. The man who had won the bid, a disinterested farmer from the outskirts of town, barely looked at Dan or Rex. He paid with a brief flick of his wrist, as if it were nothing more than a simple transaction. To the farmer, Rex was just another tool, a means to an end. Dane's heart broke as he watched Rex leave the auction house, the dog's head low, his tail tucked between his legs. In that moment, Dan realized that he had failed Rex. He hadn't been able to protect him from the world that would discard him once his usefulness had run out. He hadn't been able to give Rex the life he deserved. He had failed his partner, and now there was nothing he could do to fix it. The days after the auction blurred together for Dan, like the fog that rolled in from the bay every evening, thick and consuming. He tried to carry on with life, the routine of his job, the emptiness of his home, but all of it felt hollow without Rex. He could still hear the soft scrape of Rex's claws against the floor, the gentle huff of his breath at the foot of the bed, the comfort of knowing his partner was there. But now there was only silence. Dan couldn't bring himself to go to the farm to visit him, not yet. The memory of that day, watching Rex be sold like livestock, still burned in his chest. He needed time to come to terms with the fact that Rex was gone, that his faithful companion, the one who had risked everything for him, was now just another dog in the world. Meanwhile, Rex was adjusting to his new life, though it was a far cry from what he had known. The farmer, whose name was Jim, didn't understand the depth of what Rex had been through. To Jim, Rex was just another aging animal, someone who could be put to work, but not much more. The farm was quiet, sprawling with fields that stretched out beyond the horizon, but there was no sense of excitement, no rush of adrenaline like Rex had felt during his time as a K9. There was no danger to face, no criminals to catch, no lives to save. Jim assigned him simple tasks: fetching tools, chasing away stray animals, guarding the barn at night. Rex obeyed, but it wasn't the same. His once bright eyes, filled with the spark of action and purpose, now seemed to stare at the world with a quiet resignation. It wasn't that Jim was unkind. He simply didn't know how to see Rex as more than a tool. His gruff nature, hardened by years of farm life, made it hard for him to connect with the dog. He saw Rex's service as something that had happened in another life, a past that was irrelevant now. But there were moments, fleeting and rare, when Jim would look at Rex and see something more. When Rex's ears would perk up at a sound in the distance, or his eyes would follow a movement with the sharpness that Jim had only seen in working dogs. There was something there, something that Jim couldn't ignore. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the orange glow of twilight bathed the farm, the peace was shattered by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, heading toward the barn. Jim wasn't aware of the danger until it was too late. A group of men, their faces covered by bandanas, slipped through the gates, their intentions clear. They had come to steal livestock, to make a quick buck at the farmer's expense. They didn't know that Rex, despite his age, was still a force to be reckoned with. At the first sound of movement, Rex's instincts kicked in. The old dog rose from his resting spot, his body aching with the effort, but his eyes sharp, his mind racing back to the years of training. He didn't hesitate. He lunged, his bark breaking the silence of the evening like a warning shot. The men froze, startled by the ferocity in the dog's voice. They hadn't expected a guard dog, especially one as old as Rex, to still have the fight in him. They tried to advance, but Rex was already there, snarling, his teeth bared. Jim, who had been oblivious to the threat, stepped outside just in time to see the men retreating, scrambling over the fence in fear. Rex stood, chest heaving, his body trembling from the exertion, but his eyes were still filled with pride. Jim couldn't believe it. This dog who had been discarded and sold for $1, had just saved him. He hadn't expected it. The bond they shared had been formed out of necessity at first, but now Jim saw that it was something more. Rex was no longer just a dog, he was a protector, a true companion. As Jim walked over to Rex, he knelt down beside him, his hands shaking slightly. The dog's fur was matted with dirt and sweat, his body weary, but there was something about his presence that was undeniable. "You're not just some old dog," Jim muttered, his voice rough with emotion. Rex lifted his head, his eyes meeting Jim's with quiet understanding. And for the first time since he'd brought Rex to the farm, Jim realized the weight of what he had acquired. Rex was a hero, not just a farm dog. He wasn't just a tool to be used. He was a part of Jim's life now, and he would be damned if he let him go without recognizing the worth he'd nearly overlooked. Jim helped Rex to his feet, rubbing the old dog's ears gently. "You've still got it in you, don't you?" he whispered. As Rex leaned into the touch, his body relaxed for the first time in weeks. It was then that Jim truly understood. Rex wasn't just surviving here on the farm. He was thriving in his own way. He had been given a second chance, and he wasn't about to waste it. And as the night grew darker, Jim and Rex stood side by side, watching over the farm. The stars above them seemed brighter, the air heavier with possibility. The bond between man and dog had been forged in the most unexpected way, and though Rex's life had taken a turn that neither of them had planned, it was clear now that they both had something to fight for. Rex may have been discarded, but here, in this quiet corner of the world, he had found his place again. As the days stretched on, Jim found himself growing more and more accustomed to Rex's presence on the farm. At first, it had been awkward. Jim had not known what to expect from an aging, retired canine dog. He had heard the rumors around town about Rex's history, how he had once been a hero in the police force, but that had been in another life, a life far removed from the quiet rhythm of farm life. Rex, for his part, had remained stoic, his once sharp gaze softening with age, though the fire still burned deep within him. He had been a warrior, and even in retirement, that warrior spirit had not died. Their routine was simple, built on the rhythms of farm work. Jim would wake early, ready to tend to the fields, feed the animals, and repair fences. Rex, though slow at first, had taken to following him around. His steps were measured now, no longer quick and nimble, but the determination in his eyes was unmistakable. Each time Jim gave him a task, chasing the chickens back into their pen, watching the gate at the front of the farm, Rex would complete it without hesitation. It wasn't about the work anymore. It was about finding purpose once again. Jim had begun to see Rex in a new light. What once seemed like just an aging dog with little use was now a creature of depth, of intelligence and loyalty. Rex was not just a companion, but a reminder of something Jim had lost over the years, a sense of pride, of honor, of duty. He began to realize that Rex's worth was not measured by the tasks he could perform, but by the quiet dignity he carried with him, even in his old age. But it was not until one fateful day, when Jim found himself on the brink of losing everything, that the full extent of their bond became apparent. The storm had been brewing for days. It had started with a slight chill in the air, the kind that felt like the calm before the chaos. By midday, the sky was thick with clouds, dark and heavy like a warning. Jim had been working in the fields, tending to the vegetables, when the first clap of thunder cracked through the sky, sending a jolt through the air. The wind picked up, swirling the dust from the dry earth into the air, creating an eerie haze that made it hard to see. Jim looked toward the barn, his instincts telling him that something was wrong. Then he saw it. The horses, spooked by the storm, had broken free from their paddock and were galloping toward the open fields, desperate to escape the impending storm. Jim cursed under his breath, his heart racing. The barn was on the other side of the farm, and the animals were too far gone. Without thinking, he dashed toward the fence line, calling after the horses, but they were running in all directions, faster than he could catch them. And then, from the corner of his eye, Jim saw Rex. The old dog had spotted the chaos, and without hesitation he charged toward the horses. His body moved with the grace of a much younger dog, his legs carrying him with surprising speed. His eyes locked onto the horses as they ran. Jim stood frozen for a moment, watching in disbelief as Rex, despite his age, sprinted through the storm, his body nearly gliding through the dirt. Rex barked loudly, his deep voice echoing over the fields, and the horses, startled by the sound, slowed their frantic pace. With a few quick barks, Rex began herding them, his movements quick and precise. He used every ounce of his experience, his instincts honed by years of working with humans, to guide the horses back toward the barn. It was as though he had never left his old life. The storm roared around them, but Rex's focus never wavered. He was in his element again, doing what he had been born to do. Jim watched in awe, his breath catching in his chest as he realized what was happening. The bond they had formed, forged in the quiet of the farm, was something deeper than he had ever expected. Rex had not just adapted to his new life, he had found his purpose once again. He was no longer just an old dog past his prime, he was a hero in his own way. By the time the storm had passed and the horses were safely back in the barn, Rex was exhausted. His body trembled with fatigue, his breathing shallow from the effort. Jim rushed to him, his heart full of gratitude and admiration. He knelt beside the dog, rubbing his old, matted fur gently. "You did it, old boy," Jim murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Rex's tail wagged slowly, his eyes tired but content, as if he knew that he had done something that mattered. It was then that Jim fully understood. Rex had been cast aside, sold for $1, but he was still the same dog who had risked his life to protect and serve. Time may have taken its toll on him, but the core of who he was, the heart, the loyalty, the courage, had never changed. He was more than just an animal. He was a reminder that worth is not measured by age, by what you can do, but by what you are willing to give. Over the next few weeks, the bond between Jim and Rex grew stronger. The old dog was no longer just a companion. He was a friend, a partner, someone who had shared in the hard work of life and in the quiet moments of rest. Jim began to see that Rex had taught him more than he could have ever learned on his own. He had taught him about resilience, about finding purpose no matter what life throws at you, and about the quiet strength that lies in loyalty. Jim found himself talking to Rex more, not just giving him commands, but sharing his own thoughts, his frustrations, his hopes for the farm. And Rex, in his own way, listened. He had always been more than a dog. He had always been a silent protector, a guardian in the shadows. And now he was Jim's partner in life. Together, they had found something rare, a bond forged not by need, but by understanding, by respect, and by the quiet power of love. As the days passed, Jim knew that Rex had earned his place here, not because of his work, but because of who he was. And that was worth more than any dollar could ever buy. As the seasons changed, so did the relationship between Rex and Jim. What had started as an uneasy truce, a retired canine, discarded and sold, and a farmer who had never known the true value of a dog, had transformed into something deeper, something rooted in mutual respect. Rex was no longer just an old dog on the farm. He was a symbol of resilience, of second chances, and most importantly, of the unspoken bond between them. His age was no longer something to be mourned. Instead, it had become a testament to his survival, to the strength he still carried within him despite the years of service, despite the neglect, despite the cruelty of being auctioned off for a single dollar. The farm had become a haven for Rex, not just in the physical sense, but in the emotional sense as well. There was peace here. It was quiet. The only sounds were the soft rustling of the leaves in the wind, the cluck of chickens, the occasional moo of a cow, and the gentle whisper of Rex's breath as he lay by the front door, watching over the farm with the same vigilance he had given the streets and alleys of his former life. Jim had given him a place to belong, a purpose once again. But what neither of them could have anticipated was that the world outside was about to take notice of the unlikely duo. It started with a letter. Jim had found it one cool autumn morning, wedged between the pages of a farming catalogue. The letter was from the local newspaper, requesting an interview. Apparently, the story of Rex, the retired canine, had made its way through the town. People had been talking, telling others about the old dog who had been auctioned for $1, only to come back stronger, protecting the farm, saving lives. Jim had been hesitant at first, unsure of the attention. He had always been a private man, not one for the spotlight. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Rex's story was not just about him. It was about redemption, about finding worth in a world that often overlooks what is truly valuable. The interview was set for that afternoon. Jim didn't quite know what to expect. But when the reporter arrived, camera in hand, it quickly became clear. The story was no longer just about the dog. It was about the powerful, untold tales of animals who served without question, who gave everything, only to be discarded when they were no longer needed. The reporter, a young woman with an empathetic smile, immediately saw the bond between Jim and Rex. There was something palpable in the air, something that was impossible to ignore. As Jim spoke about Rex, the words seemed to flow naturally, and Rex, sensing his owner's comfort, sat proudly by his side, his head held high. "I don't know if I can put it into words exactly," Jim said, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. "But this dog, he saved me more times than I can count. He's been through so much, and yet he never stopped being loyal. I don't think people understand what that means until they see it for themselves." Rex's eyes flicked toward Jim, as if he understood every word. Jim paused for a moment, his gaze softening. "He's more than just a dog. He's family. He's been the one constant in a life that's had a lot of changes." The reporter smiled gently and asked, "What does he mean to you, Jim?" Jim's lips parted slightly, as though the question had opened something inside of him. He rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes momentarily clouded with emotion. "He means everything," he said softly, his voice thick with sincerity. "He's my hero. He always has been." The reporter wrote down every word. When the story hit the local news, it spread like wildfire. People from nearby towns began to visit the farm, drawn by the tale of a dog who had been discarded by the very system he had served. Rex's name became known beyond the small town, his story shared online in blogs and on social media. For the first time in his life, Rex was seen for what he truly was: a hero, a survivor, a loyal companion. But despite the newfound recognition, nothing had changed on the farm. Jim continued to work the land and Rex continued to guard it, just as he had always done. The difference now was that the world had begun to recognize Rex for what he was. The small farm, once quiet and unnoticed, was now brimming with visitors who wanted to meet the dog who had been sold for $1, the dog who had saved lives with no expectation of reward. Jim welcomed them with open arms, but his love for Rex was something too deep to capture in a news story. It was personal. It was real. It was everything. One afternoon, a special guest arrived at the farm, a man who had known Rex in his past life, Dan. The bond between Dan and Rex had never truly broken, though time and distance had separated them. Dan had been following Rex's story from afar, and when he saw the interview, something pulled at him. He had to come. The moment Dan stepped onto the farm, his eyes immediately sought out the old dog. Rex, who had been resting by the porch, lifted his head at the sound of footsteps, his ears twitching as he recognized the voice of his old partner. "Rex," Dan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Rex's eyes met his, and in that instant, something shifted between them. Dan stepped forward, a hand outstretched, and Rex, with a soft whine, pushed himself up and trotted over, his body moving with the same grace and precision it had all those years ago. For a moment, it felt like time had never passed. The bond that had existed between them, forged in the heat of battle, in the quiet moments of shared exhaustion, was still there. Rex licked Dan's hand gently, his tail wagging slightly, as if to say, "I'm still here. I never left." Dan knelt down beside Rex, tears welling in his eyes. "I'm so sorry, boy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I should never have let you go." Rex's eyes softened as he nudged Dan's face with his nose, as though forgiving him in the only way he knew how. Jim stood quietly, watching the reunion unfold. It was a moment of pure, unspoken understanding. Rex had belonged to Dan once, and now he belonged to Jim. The two men had both cared for him in their own ways, and now, in the quiet of the farm, they both understood something profound. Rex had given everything, and in return, he had earned a life of peace. A life where he was loved, where he mattered. The news story had made Rex a local hero, but to Jim and Dan, Rex was more than that. He was family. He was everything. And as they stood together, with Rex between them, they knew that this was the place where he was meant to be. No longer a forgotten soldier, no longer discarded for $1, Rex had found his forever home, and in doing so, he had reminded them both of what truly mattered: loyalty, love, and the quiet, enduring strength of the bond between a man and his dog. The farm had been quiet in the weeks that followed the reunion. Jim and Dan had spent hours talking, reminiscing about the past, about the times when Rex had been at the forefront of their lives, leading the charge against danger. They shared stories of how Rex had saved them both, how he had become their protector, their friend, their companion. Rex had listened quietly, his tail wagging from time to time as he lay by their feet, content to simply be there. It was in these moments that the weight of their shared history settled over them. The years had passed, the battles had been fought, but Rex's loyalty had remained unwavering. But the passage of time, inevitable as it was, had taken its toll on the old dog. Jim had noticed it first, the way Rex's steps had become slower, the way his once vibrant eyes now seemed a little dimmer. His coat, once thick and glossy, was thinning, and his breaths came in short, labored bursts. At night, Rex would curl up by the fire, his body stiff with age, and Jim could hear the faint sound of his wheezing. It was as though the dog was fighting, holding on with all the strength he had left, but Jim knew in his heart that the time was near. One chilly morning, the air thick with fog, Jim found Rex outside, lying in the grass near the barn. The dog's body was still, his head resting on the ground, his eyes half-lidded as though he were simply resting. But as Jim approached, he saw the signs. The steady rise and fall of Rex's chest had slowed, and the dog didn't lift his head when Jim called his name. Panic flooded Jim's chest, his hands trembling as he knelt down beside Rex. "Rex, come on, buddy, get up," Jim said, his voice low, filled with a quiet desperation. But Rex didn't respond. Instead, his eyes met Jim's, and for a moment, it felt as if the world had stopped. In that gaze, Jim saw everything. The years of service, the loyalty, the love that Rex had given freely, without question, without hesitation. He had given his all, and now, it seemed, it was time for him to rest. Tears filled Jim's eyes as he reached out to stroke Rex's fur, his heart breaking at the realization that the dog he had come to love like a brother, the dog who had saved him more times than he could count, was slipping away. He had known this moment would come. He had known that Rex's time was limited, but nothing could have prepared him for the weight of it, for the hollow ache that now settled in his chest. Dan, who had been staying on the farm for the past few days, came out when he heard the quiet exchange between Jim and Rex. His face, usually so stoic, was drawn with concern as he approached the two of them. He knelt down beside Jim, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "It's time, isn't it?" Dan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Jim nodded, his throat tight. "I don't want to say goodbye, Dan. I can't." Dan looked down at Rex, his old partner, who had once been a symbol of strength and courage, now lying there in the quiet of the morning, ready to rest. "He's been ready for a long time," Dan said softly. "He's fought the good fight. He's given everything he had." And in that moment, Jim knew he was right. Rex had fought harder than anyone could have expected. He had given his all, and now, it was his time to rest. But it didn't make the loss any easier. The morning passed in silence, the two men sitting beside Rex, watching as the dog took his final breaths. Jim's hand rested gently on Rex's back, his fingers stroking the fur that had once been so strong, now soft and brittle with age. There were no words between them, just the quiet presence of two men and the dog who had brought them together. It felt as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Finally, Rex's body stilled, and Jim knew that the old dog had passed. He felt a deep, soul-crushing emptiness, as though the ground beneath him had fallen away. His chest was tight, the weight of grief pressing down on him. But at the same time, there was a profound sense of peace. Rex had lived a full life. He had given everything, and he had found the peace he deserved. Jim and Dan sat there for what felt like hours, the fog lifting as the sun rose higher in the sky. They didn't need to speak. They both knew that Rex had given his last gift, his final act of love. The dog who had been sold for $1 had died a hero, not just for the life he had led, but for the bond he had shared with them both. He had taught them what loyalty really meant, what it meant to give of yourself, to fight until the end. Eventually, they stood together, gently lifting Rex's body and carrying him to a quiet corner of the farm, where a small wooden cross stood beside a patch of flowers. It was there, in that peaceful spot, that Rex was laid to rest, Jim, his eyes red from crying, whispered one last goodbye. "Thank you, Rex. You'll always be with us. Always." And as the two men stood in the quiet of the morning, the wind softly rustling the leaves, Jim knew that Rex's legacy would live on. Not just in the stories they would tell, but in the way they would live. With loyalty, with love, and with the quiet understanding that some bonds are never broken. Rex had been discarded, sold for $1, but in the end he had shown the world what true worth meant. As the sun set that evening, Jim stood alone by the grave, his heart still heavy with loss, but filled with gratitude. Rex had come full circle, from being forgotten to becoming a hero once more. And as Jim walked back toward the farmhouse, he could almost hear the soft rustling of paws behind him, the whisper of a dog who would never be forgotten.